In the early spring of 1951, a driller named Walter Kessner set up his rig on a stretch of caliche ground 11 miles northeast of Fort Stockton, Texas, working for one of the irrigation outfits pushing new wells across Pecos County. He was there to punch a hole through hardpan and hit the Edwards-Trinity Aquifer, the same buried sheet of water that had, for longer than anyone could put a number on, been feeding the region's springs. An old rancher named Hollis Teague drove out to watch him set the derrick, and before Kessner ever started the engine, Teague told him something the driller would repeat for the rest of his life. "Stay off the vein that runs toward Comanche Springs," Teague said. His own father had been told the same thing by a Comanche man who used to camp near the springs before the fort went up, and the warning had never come with an explanation attached, only with the flat certainty of something that did not need one. Kessner drilled anyway, because there was money in the ground and a payroll to meet, and nothing happened to him that spring. But 10 years later, the springs he had been warned away from were gone, and the record shows exactly how that happened, in permits and court filings instead of curses. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Comanche Springs sat inside what is now the town of Fort Stockton, a shallow limestone basin where water surfaced under pressure from below rather than seeping down from above. At its strongest, before anyone had sunk a well anywhere near it, the springs discharged somewhere in the range of 60 million gallons of water a day, cold, clear, and constant, pouring out of at least a dozen separate vents scattered across roughly 2 acres of ground. Early travelers described a pool wide enough to water a herd of several hundred horses at once, with a current strong enough to turn a mill wheel a short distance downstream. The water table underneath this stretch of the Trans-Pecos region was fed by rain falling on limestone uplands dozens of miles away, filtering down through fractured rock over years and decades before it ever reached daylight at Comanche Springs, so that the pool a horse might drink from on any given afternoon had begun its journey as rain that fell before that horse was foaled. People had been coming to this water for a very long time before anyone wrote the name Comanche Springs on a map. Archaeological surveys around the site have recovered projectile points, hearths, and butchered bone dating back thousands of years, evidence of use stretching from the earliest hunting bands who worked this desert down through the Jumano and Mescalero Apache, and finally the Comanche and allied Kiowa bands who dominated the region by the 1700s. In an environment where the nearest reliable water might be a full day's ride in any direction, a spring producing tens of millions of gallons daily was not a convenience. It was the reason anything could live here at all. The spring sat almost exactly on what later became known as the Great Comanche War Trail, the network of raiding routes that carried Comanche and Kiowa parties from the southern plains down into Chihuahua and Coahuila and back again, and for a war party crossing hundreds of miles of country with almost no permanent water, Comanche Springs was not one stop among many. It was one of the handful of places the entire route depended on. By the 1850s, American surveyors mapping a road from San Antonio to El Paso had already learned what the Comanche had known for centuries, that a column of soldiers or a train of freight wagons crossing this stretch of desert needed to plan its march around this one pool of water. In 1858, an Irish immigrant named Peter Gallagher built a trading post and stage stop at the springs, and the following year the United States Army established Camp Stockton on the same ground to garrison the water and protect the road that ran past it. The camp was abandoned during the Civil War and refounded in 1867 as Fort Stockton, and the town that grew up around it kept growing for the same reason every settlement before it had, because the water never seemed to run out. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, that appeared to be true. Ledgers from the Irrigation Canal Company, organized in the 1870s to distribute the spring water to farmland around Fort Stockton, show a discharge that barely varied season to season, drought or no drought, an output so reliable that farmers in this part of the Trans-Pecos built an entire agricultural economy on the assumption that Comanche Springs simply could not be exhausted. That assumption was never tested against anything but rainfall, because rainfall was the only variable anyone in the 1870s had reason to imagine. The other variable, the one that would eventually kill the springs, had not been invented yet. That variable arrived with the centrifugal pump and the internal combustion engine, technologies that made it possible, for the first time in the region's history, to pull water up out of the same aquifer that fed the springs from any point on the surface a landowner chose to drill, rather than waiting for it to rise on its own at Comanche Springs. Pecos County's irrigated cotton and alfalfa acreage expanded sharply after the Second World War, and the number of high-capacity irrigation wells drilled into the Edwards-Trinity Aquifer within a few miles of the springs climbed from a handful before the war to well over 100 by the early 1950s. Each well pulled from the same underground sheet of water that had always fed the springs, and each well, individually, seemed too small to matter. The engineers who approved permit after permit were not calculating the combined draw of 100 pumps running at once against a single spring's ability to refill itself. Nobody in a position to stop it was doing that math, and Texas law, as it happened, did not require anyone to. In 1904, the Texas Supreme Court had ruled in a case called Houston and Texas Central Railway Company versus East that groundwater beneath a person's land belonged to that person, to pump and sell without regard for what happened to a neighbor's well or a neighbor's spring. Texas courts called this the rule of capture, and by the middle of the 20th century it had hardened into settled law. In 1954, the Pecos County Water Control and Improvement District, representing the farmers whose irrigation depended on Comanche Springs, sued a group of upstream well owners, arguing that their pumping was draining the aquifer the springs depended on. The court sided with the well owners. The rule of capture, the judges held, protected the right to pump groundwater on one's own land, and it did not matter that the water being pumped was the same water that would otherwise have surfaced 11 miles away and kept a spring alive for thousands of years. The ruling did not order anyone to stop. It simply confirmed that no one had ever been required to. By 1961, Comanche Springs had gone completely dry. What the historical record shows clearly is dates, discharge figures, court filings, and drilling permits, an unusually well-documented decline for something this old. What the record does not show, in any of the surviving depositions or engineering reports from the 1954 case, is any accounting for the warning Hollis Teague passed to Walter Kessner in a rancher's front yard, or for the older warnings behind it. That absence is not surprising. Nobody preparing exhibits for a water rights lawsuit had reason to enter Comanche oral tradition into evidence. Oral history projects conducted with Comanche elders in the decades that followed, including interviews later archived at the University of Oklahoma, recorded a consistent thread running through accounts of the Trans-Pecos crossing. Certain springs along the war trail were treated as places that gave without limit, only if they were not tampered with, disturbed, or dug into beyond what the surface itself provided. The specific mechanism behind that belief was not always spelled out the same way twice across different informants, but the caution itself, applied specifically to digging near a spring's source rather than merely drawing from its surface, appears often enough across independent accounts to be treated as a real element of regional tradition rather than an invention layered on afterward. Comanche Springs is also not the only place in this same stretch of Texas where that pattern played out. A few miles to the west, on a stretch of ground that would later take on a strange second life, the same aquifer decline was already erasing another spring, and what happened there is where the pattern stops being a single, contained story. Leon Springs, west of Fort Stockton, was smaller than Comanche Springs, but it fed a marshy complex of pools and a spring-run creek that had, since long before either name was written down, supported a population of small silver fish found nowhere else on Earth. Naturalists who examined the site in the early 20th century catalogued them as a distinct species, Cyprinodon bovinus, the Leon Springs pupfish, a creature that had likely been isolated in this one spring system since the end of the last ice age, evolving in total separation from every other pupfish population in North America for roughly 10,000 years. By the 1950s, the same wave of irrigation wells drawing down the aquifer beneath Fort Stockton was drawing down the water beneath Leon Springs as well, and through that same decade its flow weakened, its pools shrank, and its resident fish, along with everything else that depended on that particular column of water, appeared to have nowhere left to go. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By 1958, Leon Springs had stopped flowing entirely, and biologists who returned to survey the site afterward could not find a single living Leon Springs pupfish anywhere in what remained of the pools. For more than a decade, the species was treated in the scientific literature as extinct, a fish that had survived 10,000 years of isolation only to be erased within a single human generation by wells drilled for reasons that had nothing to do with it. Then, in 1965, researchers surveying Diamond Y Spring, a separate spring-fed system a short distance to the north still holding water at the time, found a small population of pupfish that further study confirmed were not a different species entirely, but genetically close enough to the presumed extinct Leon Springs population that biologists eventually reclassified them as the same species, apparently surviving in a second location nobody had previously connected to the original one. Diamond Y Spring became the last documented refuge for the Leon Springs pupfish, later placed under federal protection and eventually under the stewardship of a private conservation organization working to keep its remaining water flowing. The pattern across both sites is not subtle once it is laid out side by side. Two spring systems, fed by the same aquifer, roughly 10 miles apart, both used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before either carried an English name, both drawn down by the same wave of irrigation wells within roughly the same decade, and both defended, when the matter reached a courtroom or a regulatory hearing, by the same rule of capture that placed no legal weight on what happened downstream or underground. What differs between them is only the outcome. Comanche Springs went dry and stayed dry, a loss with no surviving population to rescue because the loss was of water alone. Leon Springs also went dry, but something living inside it happened to have a second foothold nobody knew about, and that accident of biology is the only reason the Leon Springs pupfish exists in any form today. Nothing about the institutional response protected either site. No agency intervened before either spring failed, and no permit was ever denied on the strength of what had already happened a few miles away. What protected the pupfish was not policy. It was a spring the biologists were not even looking for when they found it. Walter Kessner lived until 1983, long enough to watch the town of Fort Stockton build a small park and a historical marker on the site where Comanche Springs used to rise, commemorating water that had not flowed in over 20 years by the time the marker went up. He was interviewed once, briefly, by a local historian compiling an oral history of Pecos County ranching families, and in that interview he repeated the warning Hollis Teague had given him in 1951, almost word for word, adding only that he had never been sure whether to feel he had gotten away with something or that he had simply been lucky his own well happened to sit far enough from the spring's main vein that his particular straw in the aquifer had not been the one that mattered. The historian who recorded the interview filed it alongside dozens of similar recollections, most of them concerned with cattle prices and drought years, and the tape sat in a county archive for years afterward, unindexed under any subject heading that would have connected it to water law, or hydrology, or Comanche oral tradition. It was simply a rancher's memory, filed as local color, the same fate met by scattered indigenous warnings recorded in other archives about other ground, each one written down faithfully by someone with no reason to connect it to an engineering decision made in a courtroom decades later. What the Comanche said about these springs, as recorded across scattered oral history projects and the rare rancher's account like Kessner's, was never framed as a supernatural threat in the way later retellings sometimes flatten it into. It was framed as an observation about consequence, the plain claim that ground fed by an underground channel of water could be drawn down past its ability to recover if enough people dug into it at once, a claim a 1954 Texas courtroom, working from engineering reports and expert testimony, arrived at independently and too late to matter. The old warning and the new lawsuit were describing the exact same mechanism, one reached through generations of watching a specific spring behave a specific way, the other through hydrological modeling the court then declined to act on. Neither was mystical. Both were describing water moving underground the way water moves underground, and both were ignored by the people in a position to slow it down. The Comanche man who spoke to Hollis Teague's father, whose name does not appear in any surviving record, left behind no monument and no courtroom testimony, only a warning passed down inside a ranching family until it reached a driller beside his rig on a spring morning in 1951. What makes it worth setting beside the record, rather than dismissing as folklore, is its precision. It specified a mechanism, drawing water from beneath the springs rather than merely disturbing the surface around them, and that mechanism is the one hydrologists later used, in sworn testimony, to explain exactly why Comanche Springs stopped flowing. A people who had never drilled a well correctly identified, a century before anyone drilled one, exactly what drilling enough wells in the wrong place would eventually do. None of the institutions involved in the spring's disappearance were hiding anything. The permits were public. The court case was published. The engineering reports sat in a county archive available to anyone who asked for them. What was missing was not secrecy, but synthesis, the simple act of setting the old warning beside the new data and recognizing that they were describing the same underground water moving the same way for the same reason. That synthesis did not happen in 1954, when it might have changed the outcome of a lawsuit, and it did not happen for decades afterward, because the warning and the record lived in entirely separate places, one in a rancher's memory and a county oral history tape, the other in a case file at the Texas Supreme Court. They only meet now, set down together on the same page, more than 60 years after the spring that both were describing went silent. Today, the site of Comanche Springs sits inside Fort Stockton as a shallow, dry limestone depression, landscaped into a public park, with a historical marker describing a spring that visitors standing on the spot will never see flow. The canal system, built in the 1870s to carry the spring's water to surrounding farmland, is still visible in places, a dry channel cut through fields that no longer grow the crops it was built to irrigate. A few miles north, Diamond Y Spring still runs, protected now by federal listing and private conservation ownership, its water still cold, still clear, and still carrying a population of fish that outlived the spring next door only because it happened to have somewhere else to be. Between the two sites lies the ground Walter Kessner drilled in 1951, still producing water for irrigation more than 70 years later, still drawing from the same aquifer, still following the rule of capture that made all of it legal every single day it happened. The aquifer beneath all of it is still there, still moving through the same fractured limestone it has moved through for longer than the springs existed on the surface, still being drawn on by wells across Pecos County every single day, under the same rule of capture that let the springs die the first time. No court order or agency finding has ever changed that arrangement, and none is currently pending. Hollis Teague's warning was never about a curse waiting in the ground. It was about a debt, accumulating one permitted well at a time, that the ground eventually called in exactly the way he said it would, on a spring that had run, by every account available, for longer than anyone standing beside it in 1951 could have imagined running out. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.